Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 924th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Barbara Kasten and Martha Schwendener. We're thrilled to welcome Zoe Brezsny here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place and of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Barbara Kasten lives and works in Chicago. Kasten's practice centers on an exploration of perception and materiality. Her photographic output has been essential to the last decade of multidisciplinary work in sculpture, video, installation, and public art. These works continue to examine an object's presence both within illusionistic and real space. Her work has been exhibited across the United States and Europe and is featured in the collections of MoMA, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Tate Modern, and many others. And our host today, art historian Dr. Martha Schwendener, is an art critic for the New York Times and a visiting professor at New York University. Her criticism and essays have been published in Art Forum, After Image, Book Forum, the Brooklyn Rail, and other publications. She's currently working on a manuscript that examines Willem Flusser's philosophy in relation to art. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Martha.
Hi, thanks. Well, I agreed to do this today. Thanks for asking me. I've done a couple of these, but I generally say no thanks because like all of us, I have a lot of work to do in many different areas, but Barbara Kasten is a very, for me, special and important artist. And so I'm really thrilled to be doing this today. The other thing that's also interesting is that this is, it has to be framed. I feel it has to be framed a little bit because many people know Barbara as a photographer. That's how I came to her. And this exhibition at Bortolami right now downtown kind of reframes her practice, but it's also coming in at a really important moment when a lot of people don't want to be known in the simplest sense, don't want to be pigeonholed as a photographer, a sculptor, any type of practice. But to those who are a little bit less familiar, and I know that there's some people on the line who are a little bit more generalist or really just coming to contemporary art or art of the last 30 years or so. Barbara came to my awareness because as an art critic, of course, I'm always looking for really interesting art to write about. But as an art historian, I started out in a very formalist art history, studying with people, the October group. And when I went back to finish my PhD, I went back in photography. And that's how I ended up writing a dissertation on a photo theorist named Willem Flusser, who was active in the 80s, which is one of the decades in which photography became very important. And I mean in contemporary art, as an art form, not just as a commercial form, and also moving into things like out of black and white. So color photography, large scale prints, but also, and this is where Barbara comes in for me, is abstract photography. So people like Barbara and Jan Groover, they were sort of looking back to early modernist practices of the Bauhaus and Moholy-Nagy, and people like that you would learn about in art history in your art history class. And then you would walk into a gallery or a contemporary museum space and see these really, really exciting kind of rethinking, retooling, but obviously very contemporary and very fresh. And then a younger generation was really turned on to this as well, including artists like Liz Duchenne, Eileen Quinlan, Walid Beshti, Wolfgang Tillmans. You can go see his show at Zwerner right now, and it relates exactly to this history. More recently, I learned about things like Barbara's documentary, High Heels and Ground Glass, Pioneering Women in Photography from 1993 with the photography historian Deborah Ermas, that studied women photographers in their 80s, sort of capturing them on film before they left this earth. And that was, people like Louise Dahl-Wolf and Giselle Freund and Lisette Model. So this tie to history has always been very important for me in her work. And the way that it does treat, whether it's photography or fiber arts, which is something we're going to talk about today, as a continuum, and not just these sort of isolated instances. Another thing that has to be mentioned, of course, is architecture and the way that her photography and even the work we're going to talk about today really strongly thinks about things like architecture. She's from Chicago. I'm from Michigan. I went to University of Chicago for a year and then came to New York, but I did, have spent a lot of time around Chicago architecture. Of course, Chicago's very famous for its architecture, and she's worked in places like Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And so the photography that I first became aware of was very connected to modernism and its tradition of photography and experimentation and thinking about technology in really exciting ways, but also architecture and being in a space, bodies in space, which is something we can talk about today. And how architecture, a work of architecture like Mies's work, becomes almost kind of photographic and also an installation. So that's, something that I've often thought about with her work. However, today, so even more recently, I became aware of her work in fiber arts, which was really a revelation and very interesting. And she studied with some really important people like Magdalena Abatanowicz and Trudy, I always get her name it's hard to say, Firmonplay, she's Dutch, who were involved. She was a student of the Bauhaus and taught at Black Mountain College and was in California at the St. Barbara, can tell us more about that. But this idea of starting out in the fiber arts and then moving over to photography is something that wasn't talked about so much when I first became aware of her work. And so the work that we're looking at in the current show is these seated form fiber chair sculptures that you can see in the photograph there. And she'll tell us more about those. I can tell you a couple of things, is that they were made in the early 70s, made in Poland, and some of them, maybe some of them weren't, but made with ropes used at a Polish seaport and exhibited in Warsaw in 1972. And then now we're seeing them in a gallery in Tribeca in 2023. So, quite a shift there. And then the works that you're seeing on the wall here in this image, which are diazotypes and were produced originally in 1973. What are diazotypes? Again, even if you're a photography expert, you might be a little less familiar with these, which are architectural and engineering blueprints that she originally shot with 35 millimeter film, and then actually recreated to some extent for this show because they're very fragile, the originals. But the two go together, and they are these kind of pivotal works in the sense that you see these sculptures and then you see the photographic, I'd say photographic with an asterisk in some ways, because they are this very unusual medium. And in the diazotypes, you see a dancer that she commissioned to be in the photographs nude and wrapping herself around a chair. You see her genitalia sometimes. And so there's a really strong tie to the body in the photograph, but also the body of the sculptures. If we have close-ups, I don't know if I think we have closer images of the sculptures, which you can see are these off the loom weavings. So again, from this generation of people, particularly in the 70s, people I was only becoming familiar with recently, like, well, Sheila Hicks, I've known a lot for a long time, but the fact that Barbara was very vibrant part of this history is all of a sudden being literally sort of located centrally in the gallery. There's so much more I could say, but I think you want to hear Barbara speak. So maybe, Barbara, if you want to correct me on anything I've said already, and then we can kind of move forward in any direction that you would like.
Wow. Well, you said a lot, so I don't know where I would actually start, except that my artistic practice goes back one more step, because actually I'm not an expert, or I've never studied photography. I did study painting when I was in undergraduate school, and it led to my discovering textiles when I was in Europe in the 60s. I was there for a couple of years in a job, actually. And so I had a lot of time to see exhibitions and such going on in Europe. And what I saw was that there was a lot of attention to textiles. And I saw an affinity between my painting and the tapestry textile movement, so to speak, making crafts more of an art. I mean, it started back in the 60s. People were always trying to shift crafts into an art place. And Magdalena Abakanowicz was one of the people who I admired and discovered, but I didn't know anything about weaving. So when I went back to the States, I apprenticed myself to a weaver, and I learned enough to get a graduate degree in, well, I guess it would be called just the textile design program that was at California College of Arts and Crafts with Trude Guermonprez, who was not a student of the Bauhaus, but because she was too young for that, but she did, as you said, teach at Black Mountain, and she was connected to a lot of Bauhaus people. She actually was at Black Mountain to replace Annie Elbers in teaching textiles. So my move into textiles was one of my own discovery of a new medium, but I never was interested in it in a utilitarian fashion. I always seemed to want to merge disciplines. Not being an expert in any one of them, probably by now I know more than I want to about photography, but I never approached it in that way. So I was sort of a novice, and that's a good thing, because you don't have any rules to bind you. You just sort of go ahead and do what feels right. And that's what I did. So when I graduated, I applied for a Fulbright and got to go to Poland. And I didn't actually work in the studio of Magdalena, but I was at a school it's considered the best art school in Poland, and it's in Poznań. And so I had sort of a residency, and it was a program in which the faculty would come for days and time as visiting artists, so to speak, but that's how they maintained relationship with the students there. And that's how I knew Magdalena. So I didn't really learn techniques from her. I just observed what, tapestry is so simple. Like you don't have to know anything really. You just string up a warp and you put in the weft, and that's kind of it. So, but what I wasn't satisfied with was having just a traditional form. So I relied on my own knowledge of dressmaking, because as a high schooler, I made a lot of my own clothes, and I made shapes and forms that were flat, and then I could manipulate into three-dimensional form. And the ropes and such were a discovery through Magdalena, and they also helped me maintain the shapes of these pieces. The exhibition at Bortolami is actually those three pieces are the only ones that are remaining out of 11 of them that I did in Poland. So they were all done in Poland. And I think of it as when I came back, I had a show at California College of Arts and Crafts at the time, but now it's without the crafts ending. And I think of it as my first installation, because I showed all the work of the sculptures, but I wanted to have another reference point, and I also wanted to include I guess another point of view through photography, which I had just discovered actually. And so I kind of pulled together everything that was of interest to me at the time, this new interest in photography, the sculptural textiles, and I situated the sculptures and the diazotypes in a kind of park-like setting. I don't know that are the old slides that I have submitted to you to show. Yeah, there's a couple of them with the green. I used a kind of, a fake turf to replicate an outdoor space indoors. And these chairs were gathered around with some empty chairs next to them, so that it looked like you were in a natural environment. And the figures were, I think of the chairs not as people seated in the chair, but I think of them as the chairs becoming a hybrid of both people and an object that we're very familiar with, and it's very utilitarian. So it's sort of a new piece of art, a new thing. And to show a figure in the chair and having it, in a struggle to sort of dominate the chair was my thinking at the time. So there was sort of maybe, a relationship there between reality and fantasy, or a new reality, I suppose. So that's how, and the show at Bortolami is kind of a replica of, well, actually it's more than a replica, because it's all of the diazotypes I made, which there are 12, and 3 of the only remaining sculptures. But I like it because it's in the old part of Tribeca. I feel like it's again another kind of staging, another proscenium for you to be part of it, because you can walk into this, old 70s looking Tribeca building, the uneven floors. It just is reminiscent of the time in which the pieces were made. So that all kind of adds up to another kind of installation, I think. So,
Didn't you also, when you say you had the AstroTurf, wasn't that also replicating an outdoor installation in Poland?
no, the installation was not outdoor in Poland. It was in one of the, at that time, it was still under communist rule. So it was one of the state-operated galleries that Magdalena had arranged an exhibition for me.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I had made pictures of these pieces outdoors, because where I lived with a family, it was facing a park, and so I took them out to the park, and so that's how the outdoors and the grass came into it all.
Okay, but that's kind of a funny detail, because it almost looks ahead to your later photographs in which you would arrange something in a larger space and then photograph it. So
Right. Well,
that's
that's
an
I'm sorry, but yeah, it's true. But see, people think of this as an aberration to my practice. It's like a little glimpse of something new, but it's not. It's just the beginning of everything, really.
well, that's how it usually works. I
How
can
it usually works, but that's not how people usually see it. You
Yeah,
know?
well, historians, we have to spend a lot of time in the library. One of the things that I thought was interesting though with painting though, and you say looking around in Europe, is that, you know, most of the time in the literature on you, well, the painters that it says that you were looking at were people like Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko. Those were the names that I saw. But there were a lot of artists in Europe. You know, I think of somebody like Alberto Burri, you know, who is very sort of breaking down the boundary between painting and textiles. And I had read that some of your experiments, and I haven't actually seen them, included painting photo emulsion onto hand-woven fiber and things like that. So it sounds like there were a lot of experiments that maybe didn't quite make it to the gallery. And so we really are still just kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of what, you know, you've exhibited, what you've kept, things like that. I mean, these works are still in your possession as far as I can understand. Isn't that true?
Yes, I saved them for 50 years. I just felt like they were very special. They were fragile. And I didn't want to, I mean, I wasn't interested in selling things, you know, necessarily. I felt the importance of it being a body of work. And I was a collector of photography in the 70s with my ex-husband. So I had this sense of, you know, preserving history and keeping, making sense out of a body of work and how important it is in a person's you know, trajectory, and that's how the High Heels and Ground Glass came around, which was the film about women photographers. So and knowing, you know, the names now, looking back, I'm discovering more about myself and what influenced me than I probably, you know, ever really registered, because, you know, I was seeing a lot of different art, and I didn't look just, at that time, I didn't even know what photography was. And so it didn't really, I didn't pay much attention to just one discipline. I kind of saw everything, and those influences and those people, many of the artists that you mentioned, I'm sure I, you know, saw work by them, and it just sort of becomes part of your, you know, unconsciousness, and those things come out when you're back in the studio trying to manipulate or change or see another view of materials that you haven't ever really examined before. So, and also I think there's a, you know, like there's a, when you get into working with materials, I think you begin to find that there's almost a natural kind of evolution through materials. It's like you don't discover something nobody has ever done. You actually rediscover something that's always been done or has been done for different purposes. And maybe you change the direction or the motivation or the purpose, and it becomes a new thing that way. But it never seems like, you know, everybody, I mean, not everybody, but people think sometimes, oh, nobody's ever done this before. Well, that's never true. So, you know, it's how much it just keeps, it stays with you, and how the impression it might come out later when you least expect it.
Sure. I mean, even, you know, it's sort of funny because you're making these fiber works that are not, you know, loom. I mean, maybe they were partially created on a loom. You can tell us more about that. But you also have the grid in these diazotypes. And there's, of course, nowadays, there are many different areas of interest in fiber, whether it's, sort of drawing craft in or eradicating the boundaries between craft and so-called art. But also a whole group of people who are interested in the early kind of digital origins of things, the similarities between the Jacquard loom and the computer, things like that. So there's this kind of quoting across different media that, you've got the grid, you've got the weave of the fibers there in the gallery together. I guess if I have a question in there, do you want to talk about this? I mean, it is a kind of unusual pairing, the diazotypes and the fiber sculptures, or maybe it's not unusual for you. It's
the grid that I used was not a reference to the textile and the construction of a textile. It was really in reference to architecture. And so was, therefore, the diazotype makes sense, because I was really again, creating this environment, which is almost like a proscenium, an architectural space in which we exist as humans, but yet we have all these objects that provide for us, like a chair. And there's so many overtones when you think about this, or when I even think about it in the past, that I didn't start out with. I mean, I was interested in, the chair. I've always loved chairs, and I've always loved architecture. And I had an experience in Europe, I think, that really cemented my connection to architecture. And that was, I went to Ronchamp and saw Le Corbusier's wonderful chapel there. And it was so inspirational, and it was so moving. And the way the light entered the space and reflected on different objects, and they were all color shapes, and they were the whole place was abstracted and a very spiritual experience, and that stayed with me. And I really, from that moment on, I don't even know how I knew to go to this church, but I went specifically to see that church. And but after that, I was really interested in what architecture was doing and who was doing it, and I wanted to see as much of it as possible. So I had this knowledge, this background when I came back, and I had and so when I did this installation, I gravitated towards using some elements that were architectural, some elements that were from textiles, and some elements that were using a photographic medium. It's probably the only time that I ever used a 35 millimeter camera, because after that I always used an 8x10 or a 4x5, because it was much more a formalized experience than a handheld camera. So it was just the beginning of my trying to put together different disciplines, and or doing it because it was of interest to me to do it. I wasn't trying to push boundaries on any one of these disciplines. I was just putting together something I thought could be an interesting new juxtaposition of visions.
Yep. Well, I think, two things I would say. One, I keep wanting to jump in and say, with the photography, it's also generational. Like for me, I grew up with the whole idea of descaling, the fact that people didn't have to be a virtuoso anything. That even started in music with punk music. It was, some of the bands I loved the most were the ones that were not, in fact, they were pushing back very hard against, there's some kind of not very nice words for it, but the kind of rock, and the word that rhymes with that, that was sort of virtuoso guitar playing. And that had a complete analog in photography as I experienced it, with a very, kind of masculinist discipline and a certain way of how you were supposed to take photographs, how they were supposed to be developed, how they were supposed to be displayed. And what was, for me, always exciting is generations of people like Sarah Charlesworth very famously said, "I'm an artist who uses photography, not a photographer." And I bought into that very, that was very meaningful for me, because it was a kind of liberation from a sort of institutional top-down approach to any discipline. And you can use that anywhere. It can be photography, it can be music, it could be fiber arts, it could be, ceramics is another one. It's a craft, and yet it still had a certain kind of orthodoxy. So that's one thing that, so the idea of the photographer who comes at it not from this professionalized view. The second thing, though, that's very interesting when you talk about architecture in relation to these works is the fact that for architects, they build their buildings, that's what they're known for. But the kind of thing that they also design always as almost like a folly, is a chair, So we, of course, know Mies van der Rohe's chair. We know Frank Gehry's chair. We know everybody's chair. And it's interesting in a sense that you chose a very different type of chair. So I'd be curious about some of your thoughts, like very specifically, with the chair in this work, also the performance element, who this dancer is, maybe how it's described as you directing the dancer, which is an interesting idea as well.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Back to you.
Okay, back to me. Wow. Well, yes, I mean, the making of the photographs it was a young woman who was a student probably at CCAC when I was preparing the exhibition. I think I taught there one semester and volunteered. And it wasn't, I didn't see it, I saw it as an abstraction of the figure, the form, because the painting on textiles that you mentioned earlier, I had been doing silk screens with an image of my own body, but truncated, so we're really talking about the torso, not about most anything, else that we have, but it was centered on the torso. And so the torso became the focus, and that abstracted the figure and the form. And I didn't see these as like anything I wanted to identify as a personal perspective, but mostly as a form. And as wanted to have her encapsulate the chair, become the chair, and in the way that the sculpture became the chair and the chair became the sculpture. So I kind of wanted, a metaphor, another way of presenting the same concept of that utilitarian chair. So the chair itself wasn't a personalized thing. It wasn't unique. It had to be something, known as a chair, looked like, a common chair you'd find in any cafe, especially in Europe at that time. And so the identity wasn't important in either case, but this merging of the two. And so, yes, she was very, articulate with her body. She certainly knew how to move and was willing to try anything I asked her to do. And I made a whole roll of 35 millimeter film, and there were 12 that I made 24 actually. There were not 24 different images. There were probably about 12 or maybe 10 different images, but I made 24 versions, 24 pieces. And that's what we assembled as a portfolio for the show at Bortolami. And the fact that it was outdoors in this, a nature setting, but then shown indoors in an enclosure that had to have some structure to it, or some kind of a four-cornered space where it was contained. So there was that containment that architecture, usually had, especially in modernism, the kind of like structure of internationally, designed Mies van der Rohe-ish boxes and that kind of thing.
There's a really interesting quote in an interview that you did with Alex Klein, which I would love to read if you don't mind, and then you can comment or correct or whatever you want. But this is actually you speaking. And the reason I want to read it is because you're bringing up the word abstraction, which I said in the very beginning, is something that I first knew you for in a slightly different context, particularly the photographs in the 80s, and that related to earlier, particularly geometric abstraction and modernism. So she was asking you about abstraction, and you said, and I guess this is, I can't remember the exact date on this, maybe 2014 or so. You said, abstraction is a complex strategy, and the word is often misemployed or used in generalities. The term itself is unavoidable, and there is more than one way to approach abstraction. The concept in the seated forms lies in the deconstruction of the original subject, a kind of intellectual abstraction, whereas in the diazotypes, there's an abstraction that is deeply connected to my own interest in the experiments of the Bauhaus and the Russian constructivists. I realize that must be a more recent quote because she's talking about these bodies of work, but.
Right, yeah. That was probably an extraction from, an interview that we had for Stages, the ICA show, that the survey, which introduced all these bodies of work that people didn't know to the world, and has given me a chance to, I've lasted long enough then, and that's given me opportunities to do things that, I've always wanted to do or have done, but never had places to show. So, but it is related. I mean, abstraction is an interesting thing because people, it's not always a derivation of a reality, of a form that is now being reduced to a minimal look or elements that are recompositioned, reestablished, rebuilt. But these figures are more like that because, of course, you recognize the figure. But the way in which, I use abstraction in the studio is based on the materiality, just like these are based on a form that are forms that we know. In the studio, when I was making the photographs that you became familiar with, and that I did mostly in Polaroids, in that Polaroid setting, nothing ever stayed together. They were all elements that were leaning and relying on each other for form and space, and but they were all real objects. That was the thing that fascinated me when I was making those photographs, is like, these are abstractions. I could paint these forms, I could paint these shapes, but when I photograph materials that are real, because it's a photograph, it has to be real. And so that takes it to a different level. You're really exchanging, and it's much more surreal. You're doing something with the materials and presenting it in a new form, really. It's reality, but it's not reality. And that to me is the abstraction that I was working with. It wasn't about, when people say photographic abstraction, it mostly refers to a process that has been manipulated in photography. But this was manipulating the content, not the process. Of course, it happened at a time when Polaroid came out with the instant photographs, and that was enabling to me because I could see things as a painter could see them rather than as a photographer sees them, because I didn't have to, you know, edit and proof and look at little tiny images. If I didn't like what I saw on the film, I just took another sheet of Polaroid film and did it again. So it, you know, it was all a matter of timing and circumstance too that enabled me to do that. And because I knew a lot of photographers in the Bay Area, I was married to one, and that's how I became more familiar with people. I knew all the, you know, the black and white, affinities, people really, you know, it all had to be black and white. But as soon as color came, the people I knew were all excited about trying new things. So it wasn't as, you know, rigid as it was like in the Ansel Adams era or time period, although it was it was a small world, and it was wonderful to know all these people. You know, it was like Ansel Adams came to dinner, or, you know, John Sarkowski would come over, all these famous people, and they were just all in the photo world. And it was really a great camaraderie. It's not as, you know, small anymore, so it's not the same, but I was lucky to grow up in a very interesting time in photography. And I loved it, but I wasn't interested in being a photographer. I was interested in using it, you know, manipulating it, doing things that were unexpected with it. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing today, which is still an extension of photography, but they're sculptures in most cases. But it's the use of light, the basic, that's the most important. Actually, not light, shadow. For me, it's not just the light, because the light doesn't manifest itself unless it makes a shadow to define it. And that's where I'm using it, actually.
Yeah, I saw an interesting thing. It kind of reminded me, this kind of light went off for the shapes of the body where you were talking about Kandinsky. And I thought, wow, Kandinsky, yeah, these are kind of, you were in this kind of biomorphic form. And then later, you know, using things like colored plexiglass and being able to get shadows and, you know, negative images you talk about sometimes, and you start to see a little bit of that in the diazotypes. I was going to head in a slightly different direction because you mentioned the Polaroids, and this is a kind of interesting thing. There are a lot of people running around. There was a show at Natalie Card last year with Polaroids, and they're very popular at the moment. It is kind of the immediacy, the tactility, the fact that you can hold the photograph. You know, it's not the digital photograph where all of a sudden you have 5,000 photographs on your phone that you can't do anything with. And you had an interesting thing that you said in an interview with Liz Duchenne, where this one is from 2014, where I'll just quote it. And you said, now, because of digital printing and the internet, the surface of a now, because of digital printing and the internet, the surface of a photograph is becoming monotonous, and the photographic object has lost its importance. That's why I like the Polaroid surface so much. It was so different from the general photographic printing surface. It has physicality to it, a presence. And I think, again, that's what we're sort of experiencing here in this show, is this very, you know, the material, the fiber, obviously, but then also these diazotypes that have, and then the rephotographed form. And then what Liz said in response to that is she was thinking about a kind of return to material. So that's one of the things, for me, part of the reason as an art historian, I went back in photography was not because of the image. It was because photography could be anything from a cell phone to an Ansel Adams, and that the discipline in art history had changed a lot, but also just everything from, a sort of immaterial information being exchanged via cell phones, and how that changes power relations, for one thing, as we've seen in many instances recently. But it also ties back to this whole thing with the kind of, one of the things that's very interesting with craft, or so-called craft and materials, is the fact that the digital natives, the younger generations who grew up with all of, the internet and social media and things of that nature, are the ones who, in my experience, teaching in an art school, are really interested in craft, whether it's weaving, whether it's clay, any of these different things. And so it's sort of coming from this other group of people who, you'll say to them, oh, well, you grew up with these images and you know how to tell us how to use our phones and what, all of that. Why don't you make a digital image? That's the last thing I'm interested in. So it's also these kind of cyclical things. It's not even cyclical. It's just a huge shift. We weren't digital,
But it's also a shift back to the old styles too, this tactileness that you say people now want. When digital became so popular, I was teaching at that time. I didn't teach a lot in my career, but I did teach here in Chicago, and the digital world, just exploded, and everything had to be digital. Every program was talking about making themselves digital, getting rid of dark rooms, et cetera, et cetera. But then after a few years, people wanted to know how to make blueprints, cyanotypes, people wanted the dark room experience. And so, I think it even though it's progressed so that there are these many options and many interesting new ways to make photographs or video or combinations thereof, there's also, like you mentioned, this return to wanting something physical. Well, that to me was always a problem with photographs, is that it always had the same surface. And, the beautiful prints that from the Man Ray or Maholi or any of those people who worked in black and white because that's all they had, there was some really beautiful paper surfaces, but it was very subtle and had to be appreciated in a different way. And then when everything started to loosen up, people start mixing again, bringing real objects, real paints, or making frames that were ornate or somehow complemented the image. The image alone was no longer the direction. It had to be the total object, as you saw happening, in the 90s, actually. And that's sort of where, my work was sort of rediscovered, because it was, and there were other people who were doing things like, not like mine, but with hand painting. And during my period in California had a very experimental edge. I mean, it was always, California versus New York kind of attitude. And New York was always the intellectual, historical, well-defined object, where California was more experimental and materials were put together. So I was in the right environment, especially like with all the light and space movement people going on. It was like anything went, you could just, so I was in a place where I could cultivate all of this. That didn't mean I was any more recognized, because I wasn't, because they didn't know what to do with me. I didn't belong in any one category. And that was great, because I didn't want to be in any one category. But mostly photography was my support system, because those are the people I knew. And so that's how, I grew into being a photographer.
Well, I'll just also, I don't want to say push back, but more kind of correct something for somebody who hasn't seen this show yet, that we're talking about, you're saying, oh, you weren't trained as a photographer or things like that. That seeing these fiber works, they're incredibly well crafted, they're just beautiful objects. And so it is, not, a generation later, I was showing a student yesterday who had never seen Mike Kelly's work. This is where again, I'm like, okay, you don't know Mike Kelly? Okay, fine. But I was showing them, some of the stuff he bought in thrift stores. I mean, this is like completely the opposite. But
Right.
the thing with photography, I sent Chloe a link. What's sort of funny is what MoMA has of your work is what you did shortly after the diazotypes, which are these beautiful black and white, I believe, silver gelatin prints that, they do show. I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit about that, because the works from, say, 77 or so that are black and white, and I mean, they're very luscious, and they have a kind of rigor that is,
But they're
clearly.
They're photograms.
What's that?
They're photograms. I never did anything like you're describing as a in any formal sense that I can remember. But I did a series called Amalgams in the 70s, and they were a combination of and they were overlay in, that's it. That's really a studio photograph with photogram on top and then painted. So those again are like merging of three different directions of making an image, a painting and photography, and then a photogram. I mean, photograms, I love photograms, and I love Moholy's introduction to photograms for me. I mean, I just, the idea that that's very abstract, and Moholy himself said it was the most direct route to abstraction. And yeah, those pieces, that's not darkroom work. And what I think I heard from you was like you thought they were done in the darkroom.
I'm not sure. The first I wrote about for the Times, the first show at Bortolami, and they kind of went back to, I believe, this body of work. But yeah. So, and this whole thing with color, I mean, for many people, they don't even realize like how political color was. That somebody like said black and white are the colors of photography.
Yeah.
And so, you went from black and white into color, which was, it's shocking, literally, if you're going through a photography history book and all of a sudden you get this blast of color, coming off of you at the page. So that's something that I noticed right away. Say, for instance, with the sculptures here, they have a very specific color, that I don't know if you hand dyed the rope or what you did, but and then
true, they're all hand dyed, but you don't know my painting either, and I actually don't have any left from that era to show. They were very textural and very brightly colored, and so that was how I saw the connection to the textiles, because my painting was so textured. So the color wasn't a new direction for me. It was kind of picking up an old direction and reusing it. Yeah. And photography, yes. I mean, there was, still is, I guess, a connection or a little, comparison between the old style and what's happening now, which you can hardly call photography. I mean, I think we need a new word for the kind of things that are being made, to call any of the work as some of the new young artists who are not just manipulating the process, but they're adding their own sculptural elements or cutting things apart, putting them back together. I mean, I love all of that. And that was, that's progress in a different direction. I'm sure there must be people who are very interested in the fine print of black and white, and that's gorgeous too. So you can't say one is better than the other.
Well, and it's also certain things like when you described getting rid of dark rooms, they ended up finding, in art schools and whatnot, that a digital, facility was, first of all, a lot more expensive because you had to keep upgrading the software. And secondly, that people were losing immense amounts of work, because in all these shifts to storage formats, that they were using SideQuest and then they were using whatever. And so people losing years and years of work. And obviously that's upsetting if you're an artist and you're putting this much thought and energy into it, to just have it kind of wiped out or disappear into the digital sphere. So,
and look at all the old slides that are now digitized. I mean, some of the old images I just sent for this, those were taken of slides. You can see how soft they were and how aged they look. So it's going forward and reevaluating things as you go and finding new ways of dealing with it all. That's what's exciting. Yeah.
Well, and this is exciting that you can go back to the beginning. And it's, as you pointed out, it's not the beginning, but it's maybe, this is some of your first exhibited work, isn't it?
Well, like I said, it was my first installation that I ever showed. And it was.
Great. Well, do you have more to say, or Chloe, do you want to open it up for a Q&A?
Yeah, it's up to you. I just want to mention about high heels and ground glass, because I think that's really important, because it is it was my attempt to contribute to a feminist kind of attitude of like preserving the work of women who deserved it and never got the attention. Only the men got it. And but it was, but I got an NEA grant, probably by all a man panel to do that. So, there's a balance there too. But yeah, it's interesting to me because the women I wanted to look to were all 80, and now, of course, I'm 87. So.
And I thought that exact same thing when I was reading this. For those who aren't familiar, it's a documentary. It took you 10 years to make, correct?
Mm-hmm. Well, we ran out of money. There wasn't much to,
yeah. And you were interested in Florence Henry, but she was a little too old, which you said
she was on her deathbed, and I just I wasn't that set on using her for this. And so we came up with another plan, and it's still available through we gave it to the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, which is actually, Arizona is my alma mater for my undergraduate degree. So that all kind of fell in the right place. And so it's still available for people to see or order or rent or whatever.
Yep. Well, and for me, that you did that, and then I came up with a group of real sort of powerhouse photography women, and I'm not going to name names because then I'll leave somebody out. I've already mentioned like Liz Chen and people like that, but this idea and this kind of art and historical understanding that photography was a place where women could enter, in the 70s. So the pictures generation, most of them have said that, whether it's Cindy Sherman or Sarah Charlesworth or Barbara Kruger, or all these different people said you had to kind of, it was a kind of way around things. And it's always been, that's the course when I don't teach modern art history now, but when you're teaching the Bauhaus, And you have to tell people these women were, you know, showed up at the Bauhaus ready to paint, and they got sent to the weaving studio. It's, you know, the kind of gender politics around disciplines and mediums and whatnot.
But look what they did in the weaving studio. It was fantastic. So give a woman a chance and she'll turn it all around.
Exactly. So, well, do you have any other things you want to say, or do you want to maybe open it up to some questions?
I think questions would be good if everybody's in agreement.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Martha. It's been such a pleasure listening to you talk about the work. We welcome your questions, audience members. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat and I will give you the chance to ask Barbara directly. While I wait for you to write them in the chat, I'll ask my question, Barbara. My question for you, I had the chance to see the show and I wish you so much congratulations on it. In the show, it references a dialogue that you had where you talked about the figure's relation in the diazotype, specifically relationships to the chairs, synergy with some of the conversations in feminism at the time that you made the work, and this idea of conforming to societal roles. And I wonder if you can speak on that a bit and about maybe how that's how you think about that now versus how you think about it then, especially in the restaging of the work 50 years later.
Right. Well, the motivation was not feminism, but it definitely was there, obviously, in this fact that it was a woman and a body. And so the idea, like I said earlier, was more of a surrealism, you know, of this merging of a third object, the chair that became no longer a chair, but no longer a female form, but it was kind of both. So that was important to me. But and I actually, in thinking about it later and, like, you know, in retrospect, I see it kind of as a woman. The chair and the figure are more like woman dominating an accepted role, something we know as utilitarian, as given a purpose, and she was changing that. She was making it another kind of receptacle for herself and for her body. And, you know, it was impossible to sit on that chair anymore if she were part of it. So, you know, my feminist point of view was more about, you know, wanting independence and wanting an equal playing field, and not necessarily, I didn't have the same kind of personal need, because I didn't have it in the sense. I just actually wanted to be judged in a similar manner to men's work. I wanted the work to be the judgment. And so it wasn't really feminist, but it was, if that makes any sense.
Well, you've also said, you know, you mentioned San Francisco photography. That, of course, was a very robust community, the light and space artists. But somewhere I read that you lived around the corner from Woman House.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a funny thing to say, well, I wasn't involved with it, but I lived around the corner from it. So,
yeah, that's true. But I also, you know, went to lectures there. Anais Nin was there. I took it, you know, I participated, but I wasn't a card carrying activist, right? Because I didn't relate to most of the work that was coming out. And as we know, in most towns, even Chicago, everything is related through a school. It seems like, you know, there are combinations of there are a lot of people from one school, and that was the core of Woman House too, was an institution. And so, you know, it's kind of harder as an outsider unless you share the same, I think, visual direction, and I didn't. So that was more or less why I didn't feel that I had to be active, but I could participate, if that makes sense. I did it in a different way. I did my own thing, right?
It's funny, I teach, I've taught my entire adult life. I do not make my money from criticism, despite people thinking that's how I do it. But New York, you know, we always hear, oh, it's all bound up with the market. You know, it is more market stuff than schools, which is both good and bad. I mean, bad, bad, bad. But at the same time, we're seeing this work in a gallery, you know, and it's interesting because, like you said, it's a very interesting gallery. You know, Artist Space was there for a while and did, or, you know, for a few years and did some really amazing shows. Blank Forms did a couple of amazing shows. So even that space itself kind of resonates with experimentation and old New York, you know, before you had a string of galleries on Walker Street. But yeah, so I just was going to put that in there in terms of the location and where it is right now. There's something really wonderful about going in that space that is, even though Bortolami's using it now, it has a lot of history, and even recent and really excellent history. So
well, that's why I love this show in there, because the history really is part of the show. It really makes a difference to have it, you know, have it in a white cube would have been, it elevates it to a more commercialized kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion that would, you know, could be interesting about the value of that, you know, the art world and how we value the works, and it all seems to be based on money, and that's New York and now LA too. So, you know, it's another long discussion, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, I personally am completely outside of that. I write, and it does raise the financial value of works, so I hear.
Yeah.
But I buy art. I don't deal in art, and so there are other things like critical economies.
Yeah. Well, we all have to have, you know, our own say on things, and you know, even though they're all interconnected, doesn't mean that what we do always is used the way it's intended either.
Right, exactly.
Thank you so much for that very generous reply to my questions. And I really enjoyed listening to the dialogue between you and Martha about it. We do have another question that's come through in the chat from Nancy. I'm going to give Nancy a chance to unmute and ask you directly, Barbara.
Okay.
Let's see. There we go. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Barbara, it's so nice to see you. It's been a while. I am just wondering how this work or reviewing the work influences what you're doing now. You have so many interesting projects in the works, and I'm wondering about how your past kind of comes full circle and how it does influence what you're doing today.
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, it's not so much yeah, I mean, I don't know if influence is the right word, but it certainly is a continuation of ideas that I've had all along, and they've come out in different forms. And you know, what's good for me about today is that two things: I am living long enough to let me do some of the opportunities, take advantage of some of the opportunities that now, because my work is more visible, I am offered, or people, you know, see connections that that I didn't even see sometimes. So yeah, it's just a living, growing career, I guess. I don't know, or you know, work. That's what all art is, you know, this body of work that is based on who we are and what our experiences are and how much we're putting out to share in the world. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you so much for that question, Nancy. That was a great question. And thanks for your answer, Barbara. I think those are all our questions from the audience today. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our poet laureate of the day, Zoe Brezsny. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and we're going to conclude with a reading from Zoe. Zoe Brezsny is the author of Earthworks, Shortest Century with Anne Waldman, and Ecstasy, an audio cassette of poems. She records a weekly guided meditation segment for WFMU 91.1 FM radio. Brezsny co-runs the project space Gurn on Regalia with Mario Miron. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Zoe. Hi, Zoe. You're muted. I'm going to give you the chance to unmute there.
Hello. Thank you so much, Barbara and Martha. That was just such a pleasure to hear your discussion, and I'm a longtime fan. So this was such a beautiful occurrence that I got asked to read with you, because I'm just very inspired by your work. So just wanted to say that. I'm going to read something from that collab little zine I made with my friend Anne Waldman, Shortest Century. An excerpt from that, and then 2 new poems. Stimulant key turned in pleasure, then got thrown into the game's sexless sky. Before the century, sacral redwood grove surprised me past your silky surface. What's not a real chance to save the world? Your back embraces rain, opal, and psychedelic moss. The Buddhists assembled in pools, a green vigil for you, I like to think, where earth meets sky. Creeping flocks, she wrote, and pink sugar moon, and here it turned golden yellow, blazing for one passed over. Humming they rode by, one life coming in, another beyond, glittering nimbus. I like to think, awake in same moments, when the earth stood still. Would we be writing then? Would we be antennae, reiterating ourselves as waves? The shimmer of silver blue hyacinth on screen. Are you a honeysuckle, camellia, snapdragon, or slicked back baby aspirin in a video simulation? Ontological love, platonic love. Don't let fear's structure become more tangible than your angelic body's code. Radiance in a heart megalopolis, energy follows thought as we move through a system that doesn't have our backs. Starting something, thinking about the bottom of seas, oceanic ripples, essences soft and vivid. This is meditating a gap between us, yet riding the same wave. Massive valleys, condensed depression clouds, memory of her shirt, silk in my beater car, up all night, visiting saints, you in the dawn ballroom of Minecraft, rediscovering imminent timbers of old pipe organs, dismantled 9 to 5. What's in your stars? Anne asks, and I feel closer to a message that was present at birth and how it can be here now. Though dusty wits dare scorn astrology, sounds of dawn, us all simultaneously changing, feels like sunrise in sunken meadow park, gone beyond gone. I like to think of you beyond the screen, language of the universe, luminous psychic links, brain braids, goth glyphs, suspended in milky thistle. And then just one more from, I just printed, I like making zines at Staples and made this Neuron Waterfall zine with Mario Miron's illustration on the cover. So all about grassroots sharing of pamphlets and zines and yeah, printing at Staples. Okay. Run my fingers through your silky dirt. 1.25 speed, gong acid, eternity and the end. O valence, imperfections glisten in the setting sun. Fall of the regime in a broken code. Do something brave today. Summer, cornfield, erotic, fixations, sweet instability, neuron. Respite from the hyper-speed forest, beauty of language, save me now. Luminous, juicy goose, 44, as I call on my holy sisters of long distance healing. Higher intelligence agency spell, endorphin painkiller spell, starting over and over. Discordance axis spell, a debt collector's voice dissolves. I'm trying to reach you. I've been trying to reach you. I'm happy to now reach you, be talking to you now. Thank you.
Wow, Zoe, that was amazing. Thank you so much for closing us out with that reading. It was such a pleasure to hear you read. And thank you, Barbara and Martha, again, for such an amazing conversation. Thank you to Lucas and Claire at Bordolami for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Yevgenia Baras and Amanda Millett-Sorsa on the occasion of Stargazer at Sergeant's Daughters. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Sophia Dahlen. And as is our tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please go see the show at Bordolami on through November 4th.
And let me thank all of you for all your hard work to make this happen. It was really an honor to be chosen to be part of your program. And I appreciate that Martha took the time to come and talk with me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Martha.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you so much.
Lovely.
Bye.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you. It was such a beautiful reading, Zoe. Thank you.
Congratulations, Barbara. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Zoe, for the beautiful reading.
Thank you so much.
Go see the show, you guys. I'm going tomorrow. Please.
Have a restful week.